Good morning, good morning, good morning. I am Ginny Field. I have been in the industry 37 years in a row, which I find hard to believe. Originally from New York, which most people can find out pretty quickly. And I am here to talk to you about some major stuff going on in our industry. I am here to talk to you about buyer broker agreements, but I'm also here to tell you why you need to do it. And that's one of the things I loved when Jake and I spoke about, why do we need to do this? Why you need a buyer representation agreement and how to do it. And so we're going to talk about both of those things. I am a student of my industry. My resume is, I'm not going to give you my whole resume. It's almost ridiculous, but I will tell you that having been in the industry 37 years, and been in management most of those years, although the longer I'm in, the less it's most at this point. And we are in a situation, when you've been around for as long as me, started in 1986. And I want to speak to you guys very specifically about a couple of things and where we are specifically in the industry. But first, I always want to know, how many of you are here are willing to chat with me? Are you here because you've heard what's going on in the industry? Are you here because your brokerage has said you need to start getting buyer broker agreements? Anybody willing to talk to me, or should I just launch away? Because I really want to make sure that I am addressing whatever it is that you all need in my time with you. I am, as a national speaker and trainer, I have been talking about the industry changes probably since 2020. And I can share with you that it's been very distressing to me because I'm very focused on risk management issues. I've always been. I think if you're in a leadership position in a real estate office, you have a responsibility to be focused on risk management issues. And so I certainly have been studying everything that's happening. And I can share with you, because I've been doing this as long as I have, that I go back to when agency law was first created. And I want to start there just a little bit, because where we're going to do this, how I'm going to take you through is, first, I want you to understand the why behind getting a buyer representation agreement. And there's a lot of whys happening right now. And Nathan says, broker says I don't need it. I see more agents doing it in the past. So I'm really grateful for that statement, Nathan, because you have just tapped into exactly what my concerns are. You, by all means, feel free to comment in the chat. And I really appreciate that comment, Nathan, because what you just kind of said shares with me my deep concern for my industry. This is what I've done. It's been my career. I've loved every moment of it and very grateful for my career. But I'm going to take you in history. I want to take you back to history, because I think before we even begin, we have to talk about where it started. So back in the day, many, many years ago, when I first started, of course, you can laugh here because it's true. Sub-agency was how we functioned, which meant that there was no representation for any buyer. And I can remember when I first started, we were in a car with a buyer because there was too much inventory back in those days. And then all of a sudden there was a class action lawsuit. And I want to start here, the class action lawsuit that took place. So Carol, thank you. I was invited by a friend, Janet, this morning. Always happy to increase my knowledge. Good for you, Carol, because you're going to walk away with this and you're going to tell other people they should have been with us. Back in the day, there was a class action lawsuit in Edina, Minnesota, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And the lawsuit was buyers and sellers who felt that the agents that they were interacting with had not been doing a great job of representing them. For the buyer side, the buyers thought that the agent that they were riding around in the car with and telling important confidential stuff to worked for that buyer, which they did not. And then for sellers, agents were too focused on getting the listing and not caring enough about the consumer. And the lawsuit, it was back before you did any of this kind of thing. And there were hidden cameras and there were news articles, and there was a woman who said, I thought that agent worked for me, and I was telling her all about my confidentiality. But in those days, it was something called sub-agency. And what that meant is every agent that was selling homes worked for the seller through the listing broker. So and I broke this law constantly in my beginning of my career because nobody talked about it. Nobody explained what sub-agency meant. Nobody talked about it at all. And so You know, every time I said, oh, look, there's a crack in the crown molding or there's a broken tile in the floor, I was violating my responsibilities to the seller whom I never knew, never met. And so the class won. And it represented in the 80s, 90s. Remember, Rick, thank you. Somebody remembers. Good, Rick. It's not just me. In the 80s and 90s, early 90s, there, all of a sudden, because of this lawsuit. Now, remember, this was a lawsuit that was won by the class against a real estate brokerage. One specific brokerage was sued, and it was about $1.5 million. And that's in 1980 something, 90 something money. Think about what that is today. And from that, I need to give you the history lesson. From that was created agency law. And every state in the country was trying to figure out, well, how do we fix this? What do we do? And we had situations where I was managing in those days. So yeah, nice way to launch your management career. We had situations where all of a sudden, when there was a requirement from the because National Association of Realtors had to step in and figure out, well, how do we fix this? How do we solve this issue? And what they decided to do was to create a compensation model, which is what the MLS effectively is. And through that compensation model, we then create a mandatory requirement that through the listing broker, the seller pays a buyer broker. And that's what was launched in the beginnings of all of this. And I will share something with you that's really quite interesting. Most people had no idea what that meant. And what we found to be the case, and I was managing through this, is we had situations, well, sellers were saying, I'm not paying them, they don't work for me anyway, because everybody had to tell everybody how to handle this. We had all of a sudden agency disclosure issues, and I work for you, I work for you, I don't work for whomever. And from all of that, if you look at the country, there are states that are transaction brokerage states. There are states that are opt-in relationship, fiduciary relationship states. There are states like mine, I'm in California. And in California, you are presumed to have fiduciary responsibility to the seller, whether or not, or to your client, whether or not you have a contract. So whether it's a buyer contract or not, I am a fiduciary to that buyer under California law, but that's not the case in every state. And so all of a sudden, sellers are saying, well, I'm not paying them. Or we saw offers of compensation of $1. We saw offers of compensation of $100. And it became an enormous problem because no one knew how to navigate it. Well, ultimately, we worked through it, and it became what it is now, and what it has been at this point, is that there is a requirement for the seller to pay compensation to the buyer agent. And Heidi, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Heidi says, recent lawsuits may make it necessary to have a buyer broker agreement. Heidi, that's exactly what I'm going to be speaking to. And I'm going to apologize in advance. We now, I think, have 27 or 29 of you on this Zoom call. I'm going to scare you, so I'm sorry in advance. I don't want to scare you, but yet at some level, I cannot not discuss with you what's really happening and where things are going. I literally rewrote what I have been delivering since 2020. And so we have what happened to create agency responsibilities and no longer sub-agency. In fact, sub-agency still in some states is on the books, but it's not practiced. An MLS blanket rules of compensation were created by the National Association of Realtors under MLS rules, which basically said you're required to offer some type of compensation in the MLS. Then fast forward. So all of that has been where we have been, but I need to talk to you first and foremost. We're going to get to how to get it done. But if I don't teach you or tell you what's happening right now for you to then be more aware than many people are. I mean, I taught a class in LA, I want to say last year, and there were 65 students in the class. And I bring this topic up, everything and no matter what I'm teaching, wherever I am in the country, I'm bringing this up because it has to be discussed. And I've been talking about it since 2020 and some of the changes I'm going to share with you. 65 students in the class, and 3 people in that class of 65 actually had any knowledge whatsoever about these lawsuits. And so I'm going to enlighten you. I'm going to tell you what's happening. I'm going to share with you where things are. I'm going to, at the end of the day, you'll have my contact information. I can talk to you about where do you find this information for yourself. I'm going to ask each of you that are with me today to please talk to other people about this. I'm very grateful that Bridge AOR is going to record this, is recording this, so it can be disseminated out to other people. And I'm fine with that because I believe my responsibility as an educator nationally is that everybody has a better idea of what's happening because we're missing out. So why do you need a buyer broker? Thank you, Carol. Take lots of notes. Everybody take notes, write stuff down. I'm going to guide you as to where you can find things. Okay. So as we wander through, why do you need a buyer broker representation agreement and how do you do it? We're going to start with why. Now, buckle your seatbelts because it's going to get bumpy. And I want you, please, I have the chat open. That's how I educate. I like seeing where things are. I promise you I will answer your questions. And when we talk about this, we have to start with the why. So I'm going to walk you through all of it. Hold on. Is that Daryl? Are you with me? Hi, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Nice to have you back with me. I love your pugs, by the way.
Thanks.
He's got it, by the way, you should follow him. He's got Pug Daddy. It's really fun. So let's just buckle your seatbelts and get going. So I need to start with why. I need to have you understand what's going on. I need you to know that we have not just one, not two, but kind of three and 2/3 things that are all directly affecting our industry. I was just on a webinar with a guy that you should follow or track him or see what you can find out about him. His name is Rob Hahn, H-A-H-N. He calls himself Notorious Rob. And he's an attorney out of New York, but he doesn't practice any longer. In fact, his buzz line is, I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney, so look elsewhere. And I follow him because he talks about all of this stuff now, and it's a lot. And so some of the content I'm going to be sharing with you, I picked up in conversation and being on that Zoom with him. I don't know if you've heard of Stefan Swampole, but I've got some content that he just put out. I have been honored by NAR to be involved in rewrites of the ABR accredited buyer representation class, which we rewrote last year, just rewrote again because we're having to stay ahead of what's going on. So we have the Sitzer law. These are two class action lawsuits, Sitzer and Moeller. And they're two classes. And there's a lot to detail in there. I'm not going to go down the entire thing with you, but I'm going to guide you to the fact that you've got to get more information. Then we have two MLSs. And I'm going to unpack each of these things just enough to have you have an understanding of what's happening and how it affects us. Okay, so stay with me. As I said, we're going to break around 10:30. So first and foremost, class action lawsuits. Remember what I said just a moment ago. If we go back in history to the late 80s, early 90s, we had a class action lawsuit that effectively created agency. I'm paraphrasing the heck out of this and 35,000 footing it, forgive me, but effectively created agency law responsibilities on a national level. I was in management in those days because I started managing in the late 80s, 89. And I had to manage through that. I had to teach my agents how to tell their sellers what was going on. I had to teach sellers how to deal with these issues. And we worked through it, but that was a long time ago. And now not one, but two class actions exist. And my big concern, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a moment, is that these two class action lawsuits doesn't look good for the good guys. I consider us to be the good guys. And let me explain what that means. So let's talk about Sitzer. Sitzer was filed as a class against the National Association of Realtors, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, what was called Realogy at the time, which is now Anywhere, Keller Williams, and Remax. And it was a class action lawsuit specifically saying that the home sellers are unfairly being required to pay buyer broker commission with no negotiation. Then the secondary, home buyers were unable to negotiate what their agents were being paid. So I guarantee you there's a few of you who are going to say, well, hold on, hold the phone, commissions are negotiable. That's very true. But what we would do, and I've got a lot I'm going to share with you that I'm going to guess some of us have done. I don't know that I ever did because I didn't look at it that way. But basically what this lawsuit is saying, why should sellers be forced to pay a buyer agent who isn't working for the seller at all? Why should the seller be forced to pay their compensation? And that's the way it's been done. It's been done that way since the early 90s. The second piece, buyers were never told. For the most part, buyers were never told what the compensation being offered to the buyer's agent was. It was never disclosed to them, and pretty much nobody talked about it. So therefore, there was nothing to discuss. And some of us did some bad stuff along those lines. So the Sitzer lawsuit filed in 2019 against the National Association of Realtors, the 4 largest brokerages in the country, and that's where we're beginning. Here's the secondary piece to Sitzer and what is stated in the lawsuit. You read that first line. I hope you get upset by that. Buyer broker's value is minimal if needed at all. I saw your mouth move, Carol. I don't know what you said, but in this lawsuit, I know exactly. In this lawsuit, the class is saying buyer brokers really aren't doing anything anyway. What are they needed for? Why should we have them? Why should they get paid? Why should the seller be forced to pay them anything at all? And then here's second piece. Buyer brokers won't show if the compensation is too low, forcing sellers to pay more. Therein lies the problem. And the code of ethics is a thing, and we have to talk about the code, which I'm going to be sharing a little bit more with you about the code, but just superficially, the code of ethics, it's a violation for anybody to not show a property based on what compensation is being offered. It's a violation of the code of ethics. And it's going to get worse. This whole area is going to get worse. So there was a law. It was originally scheduled to go to court in February. Anywhere, Realogy requested an extension. The other defendants didn't want to do that. The court allowed it. And so they received an extension of time to October. At this point in time, there is a date in October that this is supposed to go to court. Now, there's things you need to hear relative to this. It will be a jury trial. No realtor or members of a realtor's family can be on the jury. And the court has already decided that the conduct is considered categorically anti-competitive and illegal without analysis. And listen to the last one. The class is all persons who listed properties on one of four MLSs and paid a buyer broker commission from at least April 15th, 2015 until today. Now, and insurance doesn't pay antitrust claims. So when we look at this, and we understand it's a jury trial, the judge isn't happy. Now, our challenge here, again, this is going to go to trial in a courtroom. The likelihood of settling is slim to not at all because of the size of the amount of money that we're speaking to. But one of the things that when I was on the Zoom with Rob Hahn, and he's a lawyer, so he looks at things from a totally legal perspective. He did not speak to anything that he had not researched, and a couple of questions that came up through this, he didn't have the answers to. He said, I have to do more research on that. But he spent a lot of time studying, and one of the comments was, the judge has already tipped his hand in previous opinions ruling on these motions. The plaintiff's case is simple and emotional. Quote, big companies conspired to rip you off. And the defendant's case is complex, and the judge will apply the per se rule. I didn't really know what per se rule meant. And what I understand it to be the case now, which I have more information than I did before, the per se rule of illegality. Conduct is considered categorically uncompetitive and illegal without extensive analysis. And there was a summary judgment. Now, I do know enough about law to know what a summary judgment is. There was a request for a summary judgment. NAR has attempted to have this overturned and said, wrong on everything, and it's not true. But what the judge said in his summary judgment, the court agrees with plaintiffs and finds that the per se rule is applicable. The record creates a genuine material fact as to whether defendants have engaged in horizontal, this is what we're being accused of, horizontal price fixing, exactly the situation where applying the per se rule is appropriate. Pro-competitive benefits is a big part of NAR's argument. And the judge clearly doesn't like us, and we're not going to get the judge to be changed. effectively, he's already tipped his hand that this is not going to be good for us, not going to be good for our industry. And the plaintiffs also want a permanent injunction enjoining defendants, requiring that sellers pay the buyer broker and continuing to restrict competitions, but no more mandatory offer of compensation. So I have been speaking to look at Carol. Are you okay? You having heart failure yet? Okay, just checking. Don't want anybody to die on Mike. I told you I was going to scare you. I warned you in advance. Here's what I have been saying since 2020. I started talking about this then because I knew that not enough people were aware. And I have said consistently, and anybody that's been in any of the classes over the last several years could probably confirm what I'm telling you, that I have said, and my prediction has been long before we've gotten to 2023 July, that there is a very real probability that there will no longer be offered, buyer broker compensation will no longer be offered through the MLS. And what Rob Hahn says, weak version, no more mandatory offer of compensation, strong version, no more sharing of commissions, period. Now, and when I get to the MLSs, and I'm going to take you there. So far, I'm giving you the why you need a buyer compensation agreement. I'm telling you this because I need to set the stage, because as somebody already said in a chat, my broker says I don't need one. Well, great. As we wander through this, and I want you to tell everybody, because once Bridge AOR has put this up, I want you to tell everybody to pay attention to what we're talking about here. It's too important not to. So we talk about what is going to happen and what Rob Hahn feels is going to happen. It doesn't look good. Sitzer damages. Here's an opinion on damages, and just don't have a heart attack on this one. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of zeros, several commas involved. And the Sitzer damages, the class is all persons who listed properties of one of four MLSs. The damage range, are you ready? $6 to $13 billion with a B and several zeros and commas. None of the defendants can pay that. And so we don't yet know where it's going to go or how it's going to go, because there's no way to predict. When we talk about the jury trial, I already shared that with you. The case is complex. The position of the court and the judge isn't to our favor. Now let's go to the next one. There's another class action filed in 2019, again, against NAR, top brokerages and MLSs as defendants. Class certification was requested in February 22 and granted. And this class is home sellers who paid a commission between March 6, 2015 and December 2020. And in this case, the estimate of damage is $13.7 billion. Settlement is not likely because of the amount of money we're talking about here. It's a tremendous amount of money. And you can't settle when it's that much. And again, insurance is not going to pay because they don't pay for antitrust claims. And so as we talk more about Moeller, NAR and franchisors have conspired by mandating buyer broker commission when listing a property. According to attorneys, this conspiracy has imposed a cost on home sellers that buyers should bear in competitive market. Buyers should bear. They further argue most buyer brokers will not show homes to their clients. So again, they're very similar lawsuits with similar stuff, similar amounts of money, similar complaints. All of that is there. And that's class 2. Now let's talk about the Department of Justice. And there's more on the DOJ a little farther along, but the Department of Justice has been coming after the National Association of Realtors for a very, very long time. In fact, if you want to have some fun, you can find me on my YouTube channel, and I've done several interviews on things, and one of them is on this issue, an antitrust issue. But the Department of Justice effectively is saying that NAR, the whole issue of clear cooperation, the issue of requiring that MLSs, in other words, requiring an offer of compensation, is a violation of antitrust. And as we look at this whole piece with the Department of Justice sued the National Association. They settled on an agreement. And part of that settlement required the National Association of Realtors to disclose, which I'll talk about more as we move through, to disclose to buyers what the compensation being offered to the buyer broker was, which had not been done in the past. And they settled. Then they tried to walk away from that settlement. They appealed, and they tried to walk away, and NAR appealed that decision because there was an agreement. And then the Department of Justice was told, no, you can't undo an agreement you already created. Department of Justice have had effectively said, okay, we won't use that one anymore. We'll find another way. And the Department of Justice is here's what their feelings are. They're saying that mandatorily requiring a property to be listed in the MLS for realtor members is antitrust. Requiring offers of compensation mandatorily and seller pay is also considered antitrust. And the Department of Justice isn't through with it. And the problem with antitrust, if the DOJ wins, that's really bad, because antitrust is a bad thing to violate. So we have 2 class actions and the Department of Justice, and then we have a little bit more to talk about. So when we talk about the DOJ, as I said, was challenging the rules that they perceive buyer brokers' compensation must be made public, be available. This was their agreement. Agents must provide consumers with information on every property, regardless of compensation. Buyers' agents cannot represent that their services are free, and they cannot limit lockbox access to only MLS members. So effectively what they were saying, and if you're familiar at all, started kind of in California. You have Rex Realty, which is now gone. And Rex Realty wasn't an MLS member, didn't want to be an MLS member. They started a lawsuit. Then there was the private listing, PLN, private listing networks, also said, you're requiring us to put our listings in the MLS. We're not going to, we're not realtor member. We don't want to be realtor member, blah, blah, blah. And that too became part of what the Department of Justice was focusing on. And so it just became this massive, ugly thing, effectively saying, you're requiring us to join you. We don't want to. You're requiring us to put our properties in the MLS. Now, I have a problem in some ways, because who's really being hurt? And I've always felt that the consumer, and that's why these lawsuits, I think part of the reason these lawsuits exist is because who's being hurt, and it often is the consumer, and that becomes part of the bigger picture, doesn't it? If the consumer is not truly being represented, it becomes a bigger part of the overall picture. So that's the Department of Justice. And then let's talk about MLSs. We have 2 MLSs that have done major changes. Now, I am very grateful to say one of the company, this one actually, is a guy that I've known when I served at the California Association of Realtors. He used to be a staff member at the California Association of Realtors many years ago. And a Northwest MLS. Now, what's different here? They are a realtor-owned multiple listing system. They are not National Association of NAR owned. They're not association owned. They're realtor owned. And so they don't have to abide by the same rules. So Northwest MLS was first, and that happened in October of last year. And effectively what it did, compensation the seller offers to the buyer broker will be determined by the seller rather than commission sharing between 2 brokerage firms. Compensation the seller offers to the buyer broker will be prominently stated on the first page of the purchase and sale agreement, with an opportunity for the compensation to be accepted by the buyer and the buyer's broker or modified by the parties. So there's an article that came up. I've forgotten even who wrote this. It was in it. Northwest MLS eliminates broker commissions sharing as default. Will specify that buyer broker compensation will come directly from sellers and offer new options for how listing agents and buyer agents will be paid. And as you read this article, this was published October 3rd of last year. You can probably find it. I don't know if you're a member of Inman. MLSs were built on the idea of listing brokers offering brokers who bring the eventual buyer to a sale their portion of their commission, cooperation of compensation. No longer default, long included the seller's direction, but now it's entirely the seller's decision and negotiable with the buyer's broker as to how that person's going to get paid. And what they've done, when you look at their contract, because this article includes a copy of their new buyer representation contract. Buyer brokers firm compensation. Buyer brokers firms compensation can be a dollar amount, additional firm compensation, credit to buyer, reduction of buyer broker compensation. It all has to be stated in their agreements. It's in writing, and it has to be in writing. So that was Northwest MLS. But let's keep going, but wait, there's more. We'll provide new options for broker compensation. Buyer representation agreements will offer alternatives to buyers in their broker compensation. Depending on the terms, brokers will more easily be able to fashion their own form of representation agreements, and so on. Now let's talk about MLS PIN. MLS PIN, so the first one, Northwest MLS, is in the Seattle, Washington, Northwest, that whole area. Again, realtor owned. MLS PIN is in Massachusetts, so you're talking New England states. And in this case, because they were named, they were one of the named defendants. And in this case, they decided to settle. So they basically went to the attorneys, their attorneys went to the attorneys and agreed to settle the commission case with the plaintiffs. And they settled for a $3 million amount of money. And they're part of the settlement agreement basically says plaintiffs plan to use the settlement fund to continue antitrust lawsuits against Anywhere, Remax, Keller, and Home Services. $3 million and rule changes. Offer of compensation is optional and negotiable. The seller, instead of the listing broker, offers to pay the buyer's agent. So we have two broker-owned MLSs, both of whom have said, we're not playing that game anymore. And the thing effectively, which is unfortunate or fortunate, depending on who you are, it's a change maker in this way. Plaintiffs believes the MLS PIN was not and is not in a position to contribute significantly to the class member. So MLS PIN says, we don't have enough money. This is a tremendous amount of money, and we can't pay that amount of money. How about if we come up with a number we can afford to pay and settle? But within the settlement agreement, it also speaks to the fact that MLS PIN is now going to be working with and cooperating with the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, in the classes. That's the MLS. And as we talk about messages from the industry, and then I want us to take a little break, because I want us to, not really a break, a discussion break. So Stefan Swanepoel, I pulled it up. What did I do with it? It's over here. I don't know if you know him. He's been around a long, long time. Interesting guy. I've had the opportunity to spend some time with him over the years. And this letter just was sent out. And again, I think part of the reason for this is that it was not enough. I mean, I pay attention to a guy by the name of Steve Murray. He's the creator of Real Trends, which is a study group, and they basically do surveys and provide data. And they've been doing it for years and years. I've known him for 25 years or so. And one of the surveys they did recently, and it was probably earlier this year that I saw the numbers, and it terrified me, frankly, was that they did a survey on these lawsuits, et cetera, and the 65% of the brokerages said, oh, it's not going to be that big a deal. It doesn't really matter. I can't disagree with that much more. Because I think it does matter. And so Stefan Swanepoel basically said, and I'm going to just read a little bit of this, because obviously he has opinions, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Again, this is a man who also does surveys. If you want to see what Stefan Swanepoel does, he does surveys, and he's the one that also often you can reach top level production, and he brokerages and companies of the year, et cetera, et cetera. Very interesting guy. I have most of his reports going back, but it says, dear industry colleagues, the intense legal and regulatory scrutiny on the residential real estate brokerage industry's predominant compensation structure in which buyer brokers receive compensation directly from listing brokers via MLS mediated cooperation agreement upon the sale of a home has hit a critical point. The recent settlement between MLS PIN and plaintiffs reveals that foundational change to the structure, a decoupling of buyer broker compensation from listing broker compensation to some degree will most likely occur sooner than later. These changes could come because of a settlement, a judge's injunction, or if the industry is smart, by key stakeholders, proactive adjustments to their policies and practices. Some industry players started preparing for a potential shift a few months ago, but many remain unready. Those who do not proactively adjust face operating systems that risk harming consumers, significant legal and regulatory risk, challenged business unprepared for a key change in how they make a significant amount of their revenue. And he goes on to say, we implore brokerages and service providers to proactively prepare how to better serve consumers, reduce risk, and smartly prepare for what lies ahead. And as we continue through, his comments are here. NAR should immediately pass mandatory rule requires the buyer's broker that requires buyer broker agreements. Brokerages should, as soon as possible, require signed, executed buyer broker agreements. Agents should review their sales and marketing materials for buyer services and update accordingly. And everyone should be prepared to discuss these lawsuits and their impact with their constituents and be ready. Therein lies my heartburn for the last couple of years, several years, 3 years, because I have found that people are just not paying attention. And, you know, you can not paying attention doesn't solve the problem. As you look at Rob Hahn's comments on the MLS PIN settlement, it's interesting what he says. It's affiliates and associates. A question I got, affiliates and associates of MLS PIN in normal English, that include realtor associations, all participant brokerages, and the word affiliate and associate are as defined in blah, blah, blah. Here's the point. This is relatively contained, if you will, not really, but sort of, in that when you look at the named defendants, there are specifics. And the second lawsuit included MLSs, and there are specifics. And one of my dear friends out of Chicago, she and I've known each other a long time. We're both educators and we're very close friends, and we both think the same way. I just had a chat with her yesterday because we're in the process of rewriting the accredited buyer representation agreement program. And she was telling me she was having an argument with a colleague of hers in the Chicagoland area. And I said, what are you arguing about? And this other person, not my friend, this other person was saying, well, we're not named, so we're okay. You know, we're not one of the named MLSs in this lawsuit. We're not named, and therefore we're going to escape unscathed. That's just not correct. It's no way. And the thing, if you go back to where we began this morning, and we look at the two classes, the Department of Justice, the MLSs, and you realize that the amount of money that's there, let's move forward and pretend. And Carol, you're right, it's about every one of us. You're absolutely correct. But let's pretend we're now in 2024. And let's also pretend that these classes have been adjudicated. Everything that I'm seeing with people a whole bunch smarter than I'll ever be are all feeling strongly that this doesn't look good for NAR or any of the other defendants. It's just going to be, what is it going to look like? And where is it going to take us? And how is it going to happen? And what is going to happen? And when Stefan Swanepoel talked about, you know, these issues, he is basically saying NAR should require every member association to require our broker agreements. Brokers should be requiring them. There are going to be, and there are already states that require buyer representation agreements, but they're often ignored. And when we look at the bigger picture, everyone should be prepared to discuss these lawsuits. Not intended as legal advice, firms and organizations should perform their own diligence with attorneys as to specific risks. The most important thing I think we all have to pay attention to is copycats. just because that one MLS in the Chicagoland area was not a named MLS as a defendant does not mean that there won't be other copycats. Understand, this is multi-billions of dollars. And we all know copycat lawsuits can be done at any moment in time. And if indeed there is, whatever the outcome is and whatever the monetary issues are, and some other person or some other entity out there says, hey, look at all the money they got. Not to say, I would like to believe it's not about that, but that doesn't mean we all understand how people can be, but it would probably mean copycats. I mean, right now there are certain states that not much is going on with them, but if this goes the way it could in both cases, there could very well be copycat. Okay, we got this done here. Let's go after the next place, because when we look at the locations, those classes are relatively geographically confined, but it means the entire everybody. Those classes are not, class actions are class actions, and it could absolutely expand, which puts all of us in a difficult place if we're not paying attention. And therein lies my concern. So I want us to talk a little bit about code changes and rules changes, and then I want to open it up to any of you that want to ask any questions of me before we go into a little bit more on the things you can and cannot do. So changes to MLS rules. So the part of the settlement with the Department of Justice was that NAR had to change MLS rules, which would create transparency for the compensation being offered through the MLS, which effectively meant that instead of nobody knows, there has to be disclosure. So, and I've seen in some cases you don't see, but like I know that I call it Zulia and Zillow, et cetera, you are seeing what the buyer compensation is. And when it comes down to it, I just unpacking it a little bit farther. You have to understand that the seller is saying, why should I pay them? They don't work for me. That's a thing. The buyer's agent in these lawsuits, the buyers are saying, we didn't know how much that our buyer agent was being paid. Therefore, we didn't have the ability to negotiate a reduction in their compensation to get a better price on the house. That's a simplistic way to put it. Because it was hidden, the buyer never knew what the offer compensation was to the buyer's agent. And because the buyer didn't know, there was no opportunity for that buyer to negotiate a reduction in that compensation for them to maybe get the property for a better price. So impasse on the DOJ, changes were indeed made, and it includes transparency. And so I want to stop for just a minute, because I've got to believe, if you haven't had heart failure, some of you may have some questions. I want to find out if there's something I can answer for you, if anyone has any questions before we continue on. Please talk to me a little bit. I'm wondering if everybody left and we're down to just the three of us. It could be. Go ahead, Daryl. Do you have something for me? No? How you doing with this, Daryl? Because I know you pay attention.
It's crazy, and that's why I'm on this. I don't represent a lot of buyers, but my team is starting to. So I want to be upfront and know what's going on in the market.
The biggest issue is communication. And when we did a rewrite recently on the ABR course, which I'm teaching it for North Carolina coming up via Zoom, actually. So if anybody wants to jump on that, you're welcome to. Although you have to get up pretty early, because I started 6 o'clock in the morning, California time, if you're in California. But we're doing the rewrite of it, and we're talking about the issues of lack of understanding of the importance of it, and some of the things that agents have done historically. And so we are spending a whole lot more time on doing a better job of a buyer counseling session, sitting down with that buyer in the very beginning and having a conversation and explaining what you do, creating a value proposition so that they understand what it is you get paid to do for them. Heidi, you had mentioned something, so I'm curious about your thoughts on what I've said so far.
Well, I don't know, in the last 5 or so years, I've been experiencing a lot of buyers attempting to negotiate, even though that they didn't know it. My main question is what's going to happen to MLSs and NAR if it's a multi-billion-dollar settlement? I know that years ago when the MLSs settled with NAR, I'm sorry, not with the Department of Justice, that all of the MLSs had to come together and make a payment. So those are my 2 questions, and how, and I'm hoping to see more and more people using the buyer broker agreement so that it's not so difficult for all of us.
You know, and I appreciate your, let me speak to that. Is it scary? Yeah, it is. I'd be a liar, right? It's somewhat scary. And there are people that have said, and people who might in the industry who have tremendous respect for, no need to be mentioning names, but that have said that when, and again, you can't unwind the past. We all understand that. We can't unwind what was done. But there have been comments made very recently with people I have tremendous respect for in the industry who've said that at the time that original class action out of Minnesota happened, at that time, had there been a decision to create buyer representation and seller representation as 2 entities, still with some kind of compensation model being structured through the MLS, kind of we wouldn't be here. And the other piece to that, frankly, is we have not done as an industry, and again, I managed most of my career, we as an industry have not done a great job of explaining to a buyer what our job really is, what we really do. I have been, unfortunately, in a situation where I have seen things on some of the forums on NAR, not on NAR, on Facebook, where there are various forums. And I saw one probably last year. I have at least 2 more gray hairs that came directly from these comments, that somebody said, in social media, guys, listen to me, in social media, oh my gosh, actually said out loud, I can't believe this. The listing agent is only offering $100. I'm not going to show that house. That's a direct violation of the code of ethics. It isn't about the money. It is about the consumer. And there is real concern, Heidi, that the consumer, because when I continue through more of what we're talking about today, we have to talk about lenders are going to have to change. All of this is going to be a fundamental change in the way we do business. And the unfortunate thing is that when we talk about what's going to challenge, how it's going to come together, there's going to have to be some type of agreement, because frankly, you can't, I have seen this bandied about, that, bankruptcy. Well, no, you can't do bankruptcy, because you do bankruptcy, you're out of business. You don't have a company anymore. Right?
Yeah.
Restructuring, how do you do that? I think that's the thing that's most upsetting to me. And one of the things that I saw and something I was looking at, most of the industry is blissfully unaware. And that just breaks my heart, because this is enormous. This is not just a little, oops, we're having a little problem. This is a massive, massive issue.
I'm also concerned that it's going to reduce, the compensation for the buyer's agents. To say that we don't earn our keep is just terrible.
But you see, Heidi, you have a very good point. And here's the problem. And it takes me back to what I just said. We as an industry have not done a very good job of explaining what we do. We have not done a very good job of explaining what our value is. I years ago, and you still can find it just by searching it, former NAR president named Pat Combs testified before Congress, I believe, And she came up with this list of, I think it was 184 things or 179 things that a real estate professional does to earn their compensation. That was years ago. I don't even know. I mean, since I've been in the business, certainly, I think I was still in Connecticut. I've been in California 25 years when she was president, but she was testifying then. And, what do we really do? We are not good at explaining our value. We don't, and frankly, and I can make you smile on this one, because I sold my daughter and her husband a home, and I thought she was my kid. She grew up in real estate. It's all she's ever known. His mom is in real estate. And I realized, because she said, Mom, I don't understand what you're saying. I don't get it. I thought for sure she just organically had figured out what I was doing and what I needed to do to help her buy her home. And I realized I had failed my own child. And so I literally created, here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to do. Here's how you need to do it. Blah, 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 blah. As I failed my own kid. And favor on my part and shame on me. But we go ahead, Heidi. I'm sorry.
My daughter is 25, and I asked her, I said, well, do you think you want to sell real estate? And she said, no, I don't want to work that hard.
But we don't explain it. We don't do buyer counseling sessions. We don't sit down for an hour and explain what we do. We don't talk about pledges of performances. We don't talk about exactly what the processes are. We're not, I mean, I'm obviously generalizing here. Some are better than others, but we're not good at having the consumer know exactly what our job is. And I saw something, Karen's very good point, Karen, $1 million listing shows don't help either. Absolutely true, because it's not real. But when we think about, especially look at California and its disclosure laws, I will share with you when I'm at national meetings and something comes up in one of the, I'm very involved in the professional development committee. And when something comes up, I raise my hand, I'm saying, first and foremost, I'm from California, I'm sorry. And the reason I do that is because so much law comes out of California because of our unbelievable numbers of disclosures that we had, that not every state, now they do for the most part, but not every state had them. And how do you explain to a buyer, here's what your options are. Here's what's going to happen first. We're going to write an offer. But I saw something else that someone shared with me. It was just crushed me. And by the way, that Facebook post, I guarantee you there are folks that are watching everything being done on social media. And all of it is adding fuel to the fire because of carelessness on people's parts who don't get it. But there was a young gal, and again, $1 million listing shows, a young gal that said, oh, I don't want to be a buyer's agent. It's way too much work. Being a seller's agent is easy. I just wrote can you imagine, Daryl? I know it's not easy, but I just wrote an article. I've been asked, and I'm grateful. I've been asked recently to write some articles about, and this one is about how to serve a seller. And I said how to serve a seller in a shifting market or in a changing market. And I spoke specifically to that, well, if you were a listing agent for a period of time, you didn't, it might have seemed easy because you'd have 15 or 20 offers and bam, you were in escrow and blah, blah, blah. Well, now that's not the case. You have to have different conversations. If you were a buyer's agent, you were one of those 15 or 20 offers trying to get your buyer accepted. But you see, that too is shifting. That too is changing. And when things are said like that, in some ways, it adds fuel. It makes it worse. And we just don't do a great job of explaining our value. Nikki says it's hard to report bad behaviors of other agents who are not doing their job, and it affects our reputation. No question about it, Nikki. It's very difficult to report them, and but the code is changing, and there's more things that we're going to walk through, and as we move through this. But we must get into the place and the position of having a sit down with a buyer, I would say for at least an hour, explaining what we do. Jody says, just got my very first listing on the market a few weeks ago, can confirm in no way easier than representing buyers. Yeah, it's different. It's different work, but it's work. It's hard work. And at the end of the day, remember, when we do a great job, everybody tells everybody else how much they love you. But, are there roads that are bumpy? Sure, there are. I mean, how many times have I still sell houses, guys, so I understand it. And how many times have you been in that position where somebody did something wrong on the other side of your deal, whatever the deal was, and all of a sudden I've got to fix this problem. How am I going to fix this problem? And maybe you have an adversarial, non-collaborative agent on the other side of the transaction, and all your gray hairs are popping into your head, because I name my gray hairs after people or situations. And when that begins happening, then and your job is what? You don't want to terrify your client, but you have to make sure that when you explain what's going on to the client, they feel confident they're still going to be okay. And so and I wish more people were with us today, because more people should be paying attention to this, and they're not. And but you're all of you guys with me today, you're going to be leading the charge out there to get more people to be paying attention, because that's what has to happen. And I, all I can do is what I can do. Some other comments from anybody before we keep going a little bit? How you doing? You're surviving? Everybody looks that I can see doesn't look very happy, but that's okay. So let's talk about this, because as I said in the chat earlier, someone did indeed say that my broker says I don't need one. So let's talk about what it means now. And I'm going backwards, and I want to do that. Oops, hold on a second. So is a written buyer representation agreement necessary to get paid to offer in the MLS and the code of ethics? And we have to wander through what we're talking about now. And it's something that has to be addressed. So Steph, just prepping myself for what's to come, tried to get a buyer to sign up. I'm going to talk about that. And Steffi, I'm going to ask you when we get to that part of talking about getting the buyer representation agreement, I need you to participate with me, because I'm going to give you some dialogue that you can use. There are ways to do it. And I've been talking about it for years and years and years and years. But there are ways to do it. And when I kind of walk through with the rest of what we're going to spend some time on, you're going to agree with me. It does make some sense. So there are ways, and I promise you I'll talk about them. So display of offer of compensation, as I shared with you a moment or two ago, this is coming from the agreement with National Association, MLS rules, and the Department of Justice. MLSs must include offer of compensation in the data feeds sent to participants. That includes the aggregators, the syndicators. Must allow brokerages at their discretion to share offers of compensation on their websites. Must be accompanied by a disclaimer stating that the offer is made only to participants of the MLS. And I need to talk about that in a second, where the listing is filed. This is offer of compensation to buyer brokers only. They will not be publishing the amount of compensation sellers are paying to the listing agents. And if your listing is in more than one MLS, or your MLS is a part of a data share, your MLS will have rules on which offer of compensation is shown if it's different. So I want to speak to you about this very, very briefly, because what we have to talk about is, as an example, in California, we have a statewide MLS. We also have a local MLS here in San Diego County. And I actually had a house I sold in Glendora, and the listing agent basically said, you must be a member of CRMLS if you want to get paid. Didn't say it exactly that way, but effectively was saying, if you're not a member of CMLS, there will be no offer of compensation to you. Many agents don't realize this. Let's pretend I wasn't a member of CRMLS, and I'm a member of two. But let's pretend I did not join CRMLS and only stayed with the small local, which does data share. So I'm still getting the same data feed. And I wrote that offer, and there was no disclaimer from her indicating that if I wasn't a member of CRMLS, there was no compensation to me. I'm a member of, if I were a member of SCMLS only, and I drive, and I do have relationships, and my daughter went to school up there, so I do know it intimately, not violating that code of ethics piece. I will never show any places I don't have familiarity, which is also a violation of the code. But had I shown that property, written that offer, and gotten acceptance, she didn't have to pay me because I wasn't a member of CMLS. That's a thing you must remember. If I look at Chicagoland, I've forgotten how many MLSs they have. I was in Washington. I was talking to some people from someplace in the Midwest, and they have like 6 or 7 different MLSs in their state. And if you're not a member of that, wherever you're, like I put my listing in SDMLS and somebody from CRMLS comes to show it, they don't have to get paid by me unless they're a member of SDMLS. Agents don't realize that. And therefore, you have to be paying attention, which is why you need to make sure if you're not a member of something that everywhere else is, pay attention. Are you a member of an association or an MLS that maybe you're not a member of the one next door and you show in that community next door? You need to have cooperating broker compensation agreement or have a conversation with the listing agent, because the listing agent doesn't have to pay you. How many of you were aware of that before? Were you aware of that, Daryl? Of course you were, because you're you. But not too many people know it, right? So this is one of my favorites. Standard practice 12.1. Realtors must not represent that their brokerage services to a client or customer are free or available at no cost to their clients unless the realtor will receive no financial compensation from any source for those services. You may not say, we do all of this, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, and it doesn't cost you anything. Unless, of course, you're actually working for nothing, receiving no compensation, and generally running a free home finding charity service. How's that feel? So I'm not going to ask you guys out loud, but I guarantee you, you know people, if not yourself, that have said words along these lines. Effectively saying, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, don't worry, my services to you are totally free because the seller's going to pay me, so you won't have to owe me anything. Can't say that. And it's even more so the case today. And that's a new code thing, came from the Department of Justice's agreement. So you can't say it doesn't cost you anything. You must make sure you're doing a great job on a value proposition, making sure that you're being very, very clear with how you work and what's going to be provided. You must stop. The commission we charge is X and we pay out Y. If we don't pay out at least Y, no one will show your listing. Now, back in the olden days, when I first was in the business in Connecticut, our brokerages were teaching everybody to do exactly that. You need to tell the seller that if they don't offer at least this much, whatever that much is, then nobody's going to show their listing. You know why they were saying that? Because it was true. There were agents like the person I shared with you on Facebook, on social media, who flat out said, I'm not showing any listing or I'm not going to get paid fairly. I refuse. Not going to happen, right? So comments on that. Anyone? Daryl, do you have a comment on that? Have you heard it said?
I've heard it said a ton.
Oh my goodness. And you're telling everybody not to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good answer. We were trained to do that back in the day. We were told to do that. And you know the thing that I was on something recently, and gosh, where was I? Oh, I was teaching a class, and an agent, and it was a Zoom class, and an agent in the class was saying, you know what? I always do this and this and this thing because, it's just normal human nature. If we sweeten the pot a little bit, we'll be chosen above everybody else. And so, I said, why would you, do you understand it's a violation? The poor woman, I felt badly for her because she started getting beat up by everybody else in the class because she was making it about the money. And I can't tell you how many times in my career, especially as a trainer, that I've spoken, it's not about the money. It can't be about the money. It's about the consumer. So we used to say it, you can't say it anymore. And frankly, if anybody around you is actually saying words like, I'm not going to show that listing, I'm not getting paid enough. I had a listing that I had to withdraw up in wherever the heck, Lake Forest. And we withdrew it for family reasons. And I got a call from an agent who wanted to show it. He said, I'm surprised it's not sold by now. Maybe it's because the seller wasn't paying as much as everybody else was paying in terms of commission, said those words to me. Seller gets to choose what's to be paid. And I'm seeing a reduction and it's whatever it is, because I don't choose to show properties based on what I'm being paid. It's about the consumer. And that's at the bottom line, what most of this is about. We've forgotten that it's about the consumer. Nathan says, we're required by the Code of Ethics to show property with no commission, but how can I work without payment? I mean, even if it's illegal, people will do it. Yeah, Nathan, you're correct. And I'm going to spend time with you on the contract itself, and we'll walk through that on how to get paid. And there are still complexities to that, but you can't not show based on, I mean, there's some other things that I'm going to show you in a minute. You cannot show because of what you're being paid. It's about the consumer, what the consumer's wants and needs are. It's not about what you're getting compensated for.
But
And
how do we explain to the seller? Because it is the truth that if you don't pay as much as your neighbors, you're not going to get the same showing. And I feel like as their agent, I need to tell them that that is what's happening, and it's my job to let them know that you're jeopardizing getting the top money.
You cannot
because you're
do that.
paying less.
Cannot do that. Cannot, not. At
Unless
no way.
Is there a better way to phrase that?
I'm going to get there with you. I'm going to get there with you. And one of the things that you're going to need to do is be familiar with whatever all the compensation is being offered. But you cannot ever say, seller, if you don't offer at least this, your house is not going to be shown. That's a violation of the code. And it's absolutely something that's being looked at dramatically by these classes. Can't ever say it again. I know it's not great, Nikki. I'm sorry, but it's true. So how do we explain compensation? And I'm going to keep going with you. We're going to walk through all of this. With Mr. and Mrs. Seller, for the services we provide to you in the transaction, we charge this amount of money. Let's talk about the offer of compensation of the brokerage that brings in the buyer. Now, part of what's going to happen is that sellers, after this many years, are used to paying compensation through the listing agent. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in detail. But when I took the listing in Lake Forest, I said, I've done some research. Here's what it looks to be that others have been offering in terms of compensation. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, tell me what you would like to offer to the buyer's agent. And she decided. And I said, okay. I never said, you might be hurting yourself in terms of competition. Never said those words. And the more we do a good job of doing that, the less of a challenge we're going to have in terms of getting to the next place. Kathleen says attorneys don't take clients who don't want to pay their fee. The code needs to be reviewed. Well, the code, this is about lawsuits. And the new code issues are coming directly because of these class action lawsuits, Kathleen. That's what's changed, is that you got to remember, one of the lawsuits specifically says buyer's agents don't really do anything anyway, so why should they get paid at all? That's one of the lawsuits said those words. Buyer's agents really don't do anything anyway. And that comes right back to what I said a couple minutes ago, which is we don't do a great job of explaining what we do. We don't do a great job of explaining our value. I truly do believe if you do a great job of explaining your value, and when we get to the buyer compensation agreement, we're going to get there in just a little bit, probably after our break. We'll do a better job of understanding compensation. We have bigger issues. When I talk about the VA, we talk about lenders, and I'm going to get into all of those things and how those dynamics are going to have to change as we move through. The code was changed directly because the Department of Justice considered it to be antitrust, considered it to be a violation. Adam says, could you tell sellers that if they offer more commission, it will help more buyers be able to afford their house, offset their closing costs to pay for their realtor? There's a way around it, but I'm not sure exactly that is the right way to do it. You've got to remember the seller gets to decide, and it's all negotiable. And when we get to it, the buyer agent can still ask the seller to pay. It's just done differently. Because I really believe this. I would bet the ranch, not that I have a ranch, I have roses and I have a couple dogs, but I don't have a ranch. But I would bet the ranch. I truly believe this, and so do other people much smarter than I am. We're going to be in a position in the not too distant future, in my opinion. I would say I used to be predicting 2024-ish, and I may still be right, that there's a very real probability that there will no longer be compensation offered through the MLS to buyer representation. It will be totally a separate issue. Buyers get paid by the buyer pays the buyer's agent, seller pays the seller's agent. And in my webinar I did with Ron Hahn, he kind of feels that that's a possibility as well. that it could absolutely happen that way, in which case we all have to be much more prepared on how do we get paid. And I'm going to take you there. As I said when I started, and I talked with Jake, and I love the way he wrote the flyer for me, because I knew I had to start with why before I could get to how. And I also warned you guys that I was probably going to scare you, and I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to be who I am. Like if I were managing all of you, we would be having the same conversation, because if I were still managing, I would be talking about this, and I would have been talking about since 2020. And we'll have some conversation about it as we move through the rest of our time. But you need to have the conversation with the seller and separate compensations. So here's an example. Compensation is two parts added together to make the whole. Part of it is the listing office, part is the buyer brokerage and what they do for the buyer. Total is paid by both the buyer and seller in an agreed upon a price that they agree on. And as we talk about this, and we're kind of barreling through on this, you still have to realize that the conversations, I'm going to take you back to this until you can't stand hearing me say it, but we need to be better at explaining our value. I've been honored in my career, and I've sold homes for a very long time, and I've been honored in my career to have at least 3 or 4 times where a client I worked with, I sold their home, sold them a new home. Remember I was in Connecticut, and I had my client look at me and say, I can't wait for you to get paid. You deserve every dime of this. We couldn't have done it without you. That's what you want to have with every one of our clients, every one of your clients, that they understand your value. They understand that you've earned your dollars. But if we don't do a good job of explaining what our value is, then, and you have class action lawsuits saying that buyer agents really don't do much anyway, what's the point? How's that going to help us? Until we do a better job. It's one of the reasons that the ABR class, the buyer representation class, has been changed and altered to expand on the whole conversation about value proposition, the whole conversation about how do you speak to the value. Jody says the bills on the legislation of Verizon definitely aren't pointing in the direction of buyers paying buyer agents, sellers paying the listing agent, and there's nothing in between. I agree that it's going to be the way of the future. Yeah. And then Fung says, eventually there won't be buyers agents, seller agents will represent both sides. I want to speak to that, Fung. That has come up a lot in my classes that I've taught. And everybody said, well, it's just going to be, everybody's going to be in dual agency. Well, dual agency is as slippery or worse slippery slope than everything else we're dealing with. Because how can you really represent both sides equally and fairly? And there are many states that have outlawed dual agency. And I'm going to take you back. Remember, Fung, I have the history to take you back to the days when sub-agency went away and agency law was created, specifically in Connecticut, where I was practicing. And we spent a lot of time teaching our agents how to explain what it meant. How do you get value? And it was basically explaining what we did well, why we did what we did, how we did what we did, explaining the value and why we deserve to be compensated. And there are people that I know in Connecticut, I don't know if they still have those businesses, but there were businesses that were created as buyer agent companies only. In other words, they would not represent sellers. They would only represent buyers. And in every case, they got a buyer representation agreement. And that was back in 1990-ish. And they only worked with buyers, and they only got a contract, and they explained how that contract meant, because you've got to remember, let's talk about that very briefly. Part of the reason, part of the thing, or part of your job, if you will, is to speak to the issue of what you do for them. My job is to make sure I do the very best I can to protect you from a legal perspective, to make sure I'm representing your interests above my own, to act as a fiduciary to you, which means your interests are above my own across the board, to protect you and collaborate for you and negotiate for you to get you the best possible deal. We're going to be negotiating on price, then we're going to be negotiating on repairs. We may need to be negotiating on other points that matter to you. That's my job as the fiduciary, as your fiduciary to you. Remember, when you're in a buyer contract, your dynamic shifts. You have a greater degree of responsibility. And as I mentioned, there are certain states, and I think more will be, because that's come up before. Are there going to be agents? We all know where they are, probably, that are going to say, well, cool, this is great. I'm going to double end everything, which is part of the reason the clear cooperation policy was created, is because people felt that the consumer was being misrepresented by the simple fact that well, I use San Diego County as an example. We have 25,000 MLS members in San Diego County. And if I am a part of a private listing network, and I'm not disputing anybody's choice of business model at all, not in any way. Everybody deserves to play in the sandbox on their own terms. But if I am somebody who I want to make sure my consumer, my client is getting the best exposure, I would rather have them 25,000 membership than a smaller group. Unless if I'm in a private network and here's what I'm going to do to market your property to make sure the entire world knows about you, blah, 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 blah. It's all about the conversation. It's about the dialogue. It's about how we do what we do best. And I do believe, because there are states currently that legally do not permit dual agency. And then there are states like Colorado, as an example, that everybody there has to be a broker. So there's not even a dual license, dual agency opportunity. And I think that's also probably on the horizon, because that too is something. Can you truly represent both parties equally and fairly, which is your responsibility under dual agency? Now, Eric says it could be the death knell. However, agent representation disruptors are saying that the real estate agents will go the way of the travel agent and the dinosaur. You know, it's funny that you bring that up, Eric, because I'm sure you know this, that Expedia was created by the same guy that created Zillow. Did you know that? And of course, we know what happened with travel agents. But I think that there's one thing that will insulate us, and that is the simple dynamics. And we have not lost agents, clients still hiring us. That's been discussed for many, 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 many years. And we still have not had that happen, because we understand the intricacies of buying and selling homes in whatever state we're in. And we look at California, there's a lot of intricacies involved in that, all the disclosures and the whys behind the disclosures. And I don't see us going away. I see the industry shifting, and I see it creating maybe different business models. I've heard in some of my connected groups a little bit of people talking about maybe we're going to go in the direction of employees as real estate agents rather than independent contractors, which again then creates a greater degree of expectation on the part of the brokerage. That's a possibility out there on the horizon. But I also feel, and this is a sad thing in my opinion, but then maybe not, I don't know, that there will probably be an awful lot of people that will not be able to be who they need to be in this changing market. That there are going to be a lot of folks that are going to go out of the industry that just don't know how to be able to function within this. And I also think they're going to, because if you may not know this stat, but and this is local to me, but also nationally, that roughly 60 to 65% of the brokerages in the country are unaffiliated small brokerages, independents, not franchised. And those are the ones that may be in bigger jeopardy than the larger companies. But again, who was named? The companies with the deeper pockets, which is understandable. With the massive quantity of agent population that work with them, also understandable. But I don't think we're going to go away. And that's been talked about for many, many years. I just think it's going to take a different level of training and support. And that's my buzzword across the board. I wish I could get more people in the room. I just did a negotiation class last week. I had 29 students. It was great, but it should have been 55 students, because we all need to do better jobs at negotiation now than we have been doing in the past. And so all of those things, I think it's going to require a different degree of support for the agent population and the brokerage population. And that's my reason for doing this in the first place, is not enough people are paying attention. Not enough people are even aware of what is going on. And it's very sad. And we can't afford to have that happen. It just can't be. So I'm going to break us now, because we're going to go into more of the agreement itself. It's 20 after. So let's come back together at about 20 of, and get up, walk around, take a few breaths, recover from the morning. And I'll see you at 20 minutes to 11. Well, I want to get back to work, and I know we often trickle in slowly from break, which is fine. Hi, Nikki.
I'm
Where are you located, Nikki?
in the Bay Area, mainly in the East Bay, Oakland, Berkeley area.
Got it. I used to teach a lot up in San Mateo. So I haven't been up there, and I used to teach in Pleasanton a lot too, back when I was doing a lot of work with the California Association. I haven't been back up there in a while. It's always been one of my favorite places. So pretty. My
You're
daughter-
in San Diego, you mentioned?
I'm in Oceanside, which is North San Diego County. Yeah. My parents came out here in 1976, and I came out in 1979 and absolutely hated San Diego. I found it to be the most boring place on the planet. I had been working and living in Massachusetts, and you know, I knew I didn't belong the first time. I was single, so first time guy comes to pick me up in OP shorts, flip flops, and Hawaiian shirt. I said, I don't belong here. I got to get out. That was a long time ago. A long time ago. It's fascinating. It's changed now. Now it's become like a hub, right?
Yeah.
I think what changed in San Diego County is changes of economy. Went from a predominantly military area to now biotechnology and medical technology and medicine in general. So it's changed the entire dynamics. But yeah, it
Right.
truly was a place. I've been in Boston running companies, and I come to California, San Diego, and if the surf was up, nobody was showing up for work. It's just doesn't, that when New Yorkers don't do that, right?
But the weather is so nice. It's all about the weather here.
It is about the weather. It is gorgeous. Even though it's warm, it's not nearly as warm as everybody else is experiencing. It's when you see a heat dome on the morning news, you say, holy cow, I'm just going to go back into my solar powered air conditioning system. So I know everybody's probably a little ramped. I want us to keep going. We're going to spend some time here. A couple of things that I did on break that I wanted to share with you. I don't know if everybody's back because I can't see everybody, but it looks like most everybody's back. Because again, I'm going back to Rob Hahn, and the reason I'm going back to him is because he truly is a student. He is somebody who doesn't create alarming comments without data to back it up. And so what he is thinking in terms of settlement, like if both lawsuits are won by the plaintiffs, it's a tremendous amount of money. And he feels that most likely outcome is a structured settlement over a long time. And then some of the other things, compensation will be negotiated in every case. And he is concerned, as I am, about the steering issues for the consumer, as we've forgetting. He actually feels, and I unfortunately agree with him, that it will create, and it was, as it was said before we cut to break, more about the money and less about the consumer, and that hurts my heart, you know. He talked about the Cool Kids Club, and he actually feels, and I would like to believe that's not true, and I think it can be untrue if everybody, all the brokerages do a better job of educating their agent population, but that it'll be harder for newer agents to succeed. More experienced agents will be able to potentially charge more because of their experience base. There's going to have to be a solution to that. You know, the whole issue of recruiting, I think, will be different. But again, recruiting with good education will not be a thing to me. At least I don't believe so. I still will always go back to the very simple thing that we need to be, as an industry, better at educating our agent populations and ourselves, frankly. There's so much amazing education offered through the National Association of Realtors that not enough people step up for and are participating in. And that, you know, that just makes it stronger in terms of educated agents make a stronger brokerage. But it should be interesting to see where it all goes. I think massive changes could be but the thing that's upsetting, as I said earlier, is the simple issue of not enough people are paying attention. And I was grateful that some of you who started with me this morning had been paying attention and are aware. Heidi, do you have any comments to share before we launch into the next segment?
Well, the only, I mean, I've been following Rob Hahn for years too. My sense is that our compensation is going to go down dramatically as the buyer's agent. I mean,
I think I hear you, and I'm not going to say, as Rob Hahn says in his, I don't know if you were on that webinar with me when I was on, but I think it's going to come down to very simply how well we present what we deserve to get paid to do. I think that more than ever in my industry, of course, when the whole thing changed, when sub-agency went away, we were not a technological country at that point in time. I joke about this. When I started in the business, the phone was attached to the wall. Oh my gosh, we had to actually go to it and pick it up. And that meant that information was more controlled. I think today, because of the syndicator aggregators, we as an industry have to do a better job of education. I joke about this, but when I teach the senior real estate specialist class, which I love teaching because I work a lot with the senior population, and I talk about your value proposition, because I talk about it in pretty much everything. And I often will say to the students in that class, you know, I still sell houses and I'm a senior real estate specialist. Tell me how you and I are going up for the same listing. What would you say to compete with me personally? And I say that on purpose. And I know it's a little scary, intimidating, because I know how to do this stuff. And I think I know even more because I'm an educator on these things. But we have to be prepared for that at all times. We have to be better at understanding our value. We have to be better at explaining what it is we actually do. You know, I have a seller friend, a very, very dear friend of my family, who's gotten himself in trouble. And I detest having to do short sales. I'm hoping with all my fragment of being that it's not going to be a short, that I'm going to be able to negotiate a break even, if not a little bit of profit for him. It really depends on the condition of the property. But I've been educated in that area.
right.
I've chosen to be more educated in that area. I have decided to, what else can I learn? I shared just the other day when I talked about, you know, the whole recruiting class. I just taught a 2-day recruiting class. And I spoke to the issue of recruiting, and I talked about why CRB mattered to me. And I talked about why I got my CRB in the 90s, predominantly because I wanted to be the very, very best that I could. And I think one of the things that is frustrating for me personally, and I'd love your thoughts, all of your thoughts, is that, and this has been spoken about for decades, the barrier to entry is too low. I mean, I was talking to somebody in Indiana, I think, on a class. It's harder to get a hairdresser's license in the state of California than it is to get a real estate license.
Well, I also feel that, you know, the statistic and of 65% of the brokerages are smaller. I think that's the case for our local association. Now, if you go in the South Bay, it actually is not the same case. And I think that our associations and our national association and our statewide association has failed us in helping us educating the public our values, especially on the buyer's agent side.
So what I'm very curious about that, because it's not the first time I've heard it. So I really want your input. I'm very grateful to say that I have some relationships at NAR because I do so much work for them. Where do you think, or what do you think NAR could have done a better job doing?
In regards to this issue or overall?
overall?
Oh, well, overall, I think that they could have worked more close, they could work more closely with individual associations. I know that it's all volunteer based, and that they come back and they bring us the information. And it depends on the association, but we don't get a lot of that information back. We don't get it back from our leadership. And I've done leadership. I've gone to NAR, I've gone to CAR. So, and I've seen it in different associations, and it's not an equal level, but I think they need to reach out to the associations and to the MLSs. They need to work with MLSs also, and outreach to the agents for us to, for them to show our proposition. You know, I mean, I see a lot of Redfin, Zillow type buyers come through, and it's so disappointing. I try and educate these buyers in open houses. I'm like, look, I'm not looking for a buyer, but I'd like to give you some advice. And you really need to work with a local experienced realtor, not just somebody who's going to open the door for you. So that's just.
And that's an interesting point, but I also will share with you that one of my and it's a frustration as an educator, and there are two that I could speak to that I want to speak to. I don't disagree with you. In no way do I feel your comment is wrong, but there's also got to be, there's a balance, I guess, is the way I want to put it. And you know what the balance is? I can't tell you how many times when I will take somebody, I've forgotten which class it is, but there's one class I will take them live to the National Association of Realtors website. And I take them to, I said, so, because I have seen on, remember the post on NAR's, on one of the groups on NAR groups, where I'm not going to show that house because they're not offering enough compensation. I have taken people live in a classroom to the NAR website, take them to the research and statistics area, and ask the group if they were aware that this was all done for them on their behalf. Were they aware that this existed? Were they aware that all of this data was available to them at no cost? Were they using any of the data? Because that's the thing, it's kind of almost, the amount of data that's available at NAR is almost overwhelming. And the same for CAR. It's almost overwhelming how much data there is. And
I agree with you, but we have a membership where somewhere between about 2,800 and 3,000, and we have 1%, not 10%.
1% of what?
Is in this meeting today.
Oh, I agree. Oh, preach it, baby. You have no idea. Preach it, honey.
Yeah.
You're talking to the choir right now, because I have actually begged to get people to come. I do a lot of promotional videos. By the way, Jake shared this with me. He had over 100, and shared with me this morning when we were starting. He said 110 people signed up to be here today. And we have, let me go to the number. 32 people. So 110 people signed up and 32 showed. What does that say? Yeah. So that's why I'm going to ask all of you guys that are actually here with us together to please go back and say, you know what, you missed something kind of important. And I'm really thrilled that Jake is willing to provide this to the membership, which is why we're recording, so that we can provide it to the membership, and I can also share it myself to others, with others that weren't here. And even the letter from Swanepoel, this has been going on for several years. I mean, the first class action was request for certification in 2019. It's 2023. And okay, let's allow for some time for COVID, but come on, folks. Why is there all of a sudden this level of momentum? Why is all of a sudden there is like, oh my goodness, we're not paying attention. I've been talking about not paying attention for 3.5 years. But you're not wrong. You're absolutely correct, Heidi. And I beg people to come, and I can't get people in the room. That's all I've got. So any other comments, Carol or Nikki? No? Okay. Carol says, I'm glad to be here. Thank you. I'm glad you're here, Carol. So please make sure you tell everybody else about what they missed and go, neener, 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 you missed it. I don't know when Jake will have it posted, but we are going to be able to keep going. So let's just talk. We're almost at 11. We've got until noontime, and we're going to talk more about some of these processes as we wander through. Karen says, change the title to End of Your Commission. I don't know that I can do that, Karen. The end of your commissions as you know it. Isn't there a song that's the end of the world as we know it? Dun, dun, dun. I don't know. But when we talk about what we're talking about, let's keep going. So as we look at the buyer representation piece and we look at offers of compensation, and let's just pretend that you have a buyer, and there's some more things we have to talk about through this. Can the buyer agent representing that buyer call the listing agent prior to the showing and ask if the seller will pay more? Now, we all know that it's a violation of the code to negotiate in writing at the time of an offer to get a higher compensation. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is that can the listing agent on behalf, the buyer's agent on behalf of the buyer make a call to the listing agent and ask the listing agent to please ask the seller if they would be willing to pay more. Note my note, listing agent must ask the seller. So I'm going to speak to that very briefly because we all know what happened, which also hurts my heart. Listing agent can say, I'm not going to do that. Why should I do that? We know what the offer compensation is. But they must. They have an obligation because remember, where I get frustrated as a leader and frustrated in so many ways is that we forget as an industry, and I'm broad basing, sometimes we forget that we're not the principal. We are the agent for the principal. The principal makes decisions, not us. So a listing agent can't say, I'm not even going to ask. They're going to say no. Can't say that. They have an obligation to neutrally ask the seller if they would be willing. Seller has the ability to say, no, I won't. And there's thing one. Thing two, if they say yes, there has to be something in writing that confirms that the seller is willing to pay a little bit more. And then the listing agent probably has to do a modification of terms to the listing agreement to have confirmation that the seller is willing to pay a little bit more to the buyer's agent. Thing three, and this is very, very important, and this comes back to where we're going to take the rest of our time together. The buyer then can decide, do they want to see the property anyway? The buyer can pay the brokerage fee, can use the contract to ask the seller to pay. But if the seller's unwilling, this is not terribly different than a for sale by owner in some ways, because if a sale by owner, they always want to save on the commission. And if for sale by owner and the buyer likes the property, then the seller has the ability to say no, which is why they are responding that way. But the point would be, in a for sale by owner, you have to negotiate with the seller whether or not they're willing to pay the buyer agent compensation. Okay, same. At some level, it's the same. The listing agent, in the case of a listing agent, doesn't have the right to say, I'm not going to talk to the seller. So here's what we have to realize, some of the things that we must discuss. No written agreement. Here's what you have to remember. Remember, let's pretend, because I'm a big fan of pretending. is very good at that as a job. Let's pretend you've done your value proposition conversation. You've done your buyer counseling session wherein you spoke about your value proposition. You now are in a situation where you have a clarity as to what your buyer wants, what kind of home they're looking for, what it looks like, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, blah, 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 blah. And you've had the conversation with the buyer representation agreement, and you've come up with a plan in terms of how that's going to be dealt with. And let's pretend the buyer wants a 4-2 something something, and they have this much to spend, whatever this much is. And you've agreed with them at a certain compensation package, and one of the properties that's fitting their criteria fits their criteria. In other words, it's a 4-2 or 4-3 or whatever the case may be that they want. Then they have the right to say, they decide whether or not they want to see that property. It's on them. And we're going to spend time on this as we move through. So disclose the range of compensation to the buyers prior to the showing. You have the conversation about the buyer representation agreement. Prior to writing an offer, you disclose again what the actual offer of compensation is going to be to the buyer so they're fully informed. And then you must make sure you show every property. In the case of no written agreement, everything, whether the compensation is what you want or not. So if they don't want to sign a written agreement with you, you're going to discuss the compensation package. You're going to write the offer and say, hey, just want to make sure you understand, offer of compensation is this number. And you have to still show everything that fits their criteria. You cannot choose not to show something because the offer of compensation is not what you want to have. You cannot refuse it. Violation of the code. Remember, it's the consumer, not you, that's primary. And so that's with no agreement. Now let's talk about this. No agreement, then you're going to work. You must show anyway. You cannot refuse to show. That can be the rub for a lot of people. That was clearly the rub for that person who posted something on social media. I mean, how much dumber could it be? I'm not showing that because, and that's not okay. If you're not happy with the compensation being offered, if it's still being offered at all, which in the future it may not be, whole separate conversation. We've talked about it. We're probably going to come back to it. You're then in a position of saying you're going to work for whatever the compensation is, no matter what. You're still going to show the property, no matter what. You can't refuse to, because it's a violation of the code of ethics to do that. The other option is, you know what? You can look at it with somebody else or get an agreement signed. I have shown homes in the last, I normally am a listing agent, but lately it's, most of my friends' children have been buying homes through me, including my own. And in every single buyer case I've shown, the offer of compensation was not that there is a typical, if you will, but the offer of compensation was not nearly as high as it once was at one point in time. It didn't matter. I was showing the house anyway. I was getting paid whatever it was being offered to me, and I accepted it. In every single case over the last 2 years, every single buyer was either the child of a close friend, my own child, or one of my daughter's own close friends. And so I let it be. I accepted what was offered. I sold the home. Now, remember, you have to do business planning. You have to have a plan. And I'm going to share this with you because this is manager moment. Forgive me, but I always have to do manager moments at some point in time. Got to remember, you have to have a business plan. You have to understand what your business plan looks like. And whatever the compensation is the compensation. And if you have to adjust your business plan and say, well, in order to offset some of the compensations are not the same, maybe I need to sell more houses. Okay, let's go do that. So you're no written agreement. You're going to work for whatever is being offered, which is what I've done. You're going to tell the buyer, I can refer you to somebody else who's not going to care as much. That's not fair. I want to unwind that. That's not fair. I can refer you to somebody else, and it may not matter. Because it may not matter to somebody else. It didn't matter to me. Someone else might have said, I'm not going to show it. There's not enough for me. Or you have them sign the agreement. And you have to look at it that way. So let's talk about what the agreement actually states, what it says. So this is the California form Buyer representation agreement and broker compensation agreement. It's a very simple thing. This is the very top of the page. I'm not going to go too deeply with it at this point. And it's basically between the buyer and the broker, beginning on this date, ending on that date. And I want to talk through some of this with you. Now, someone said earlier that there was a struggle in getting a buyer to sign the document. And I'm going to guarantee you I could come up with all of their objections. Well, I've never had to do that before. How am I going to have to pay you? And I frankly will tell you that I've never had a problem getting a buyer representation agreement signed. But let me walk you through some of these processes and then we'll unpack it a tiny bit. So that's how it begins. No pre-existing buyer representation agreement. This is, you don't have a pre-existing relationship. Remember, by the way, it is a requirement for you. If you're doing open houses and a buyer walks in and you have the conversation, your responsibility is to ask them if they are under contract with someone else. Not, are you working with someone else? No. Have you signed an agreement? Do you have an existing representation agreement with someone else? Right now, where it's not the norm, that's the thing that you got to do. Later on, when I'm assuming we're all going to have them, it could very well happen that buyer representation agreements exist across the country. So it's not going to be untypical. No more than having a listing agreement with someone is untypical. But in the beginning, if you're doing an open house, you have an obligation to ask them if they have a contractual relationship with someone else. Next. Here's what the first section is. And I obviously missed having a T in the wrong spot. Forgive that mistake. I will fix it later. We talked about no pre-existing representation agreement. Property to be acquired. Now, I have seen, and I have talked to attorneys, somebody put in location, the state of California, everywhere, all price points. I would love anybody to comment. Do you think that's enforceable? Thank you, Daryl. I knew you would say that. Go ahead, say something.
No, it's probably too broad of a scope for what they could get compensation for. And they're not specialists in all those different markets. They're only specialists in a certain regionalized area.
You're absolutely correct. And I knew you would know that answer. You've got to realize, let's pretend at the end of the day that buyer doesn't like you anymore. And they file a suit against you or an arbitration against you. And maybe they have an attorney. What's the attorney's first question going to be to you? Can you really tell me you know everywhere? Do you know Fresno intimately? How about, do you understand Lancaster? So if you put down the entire state of California, that would mean you would be showing homes in Fresno and Lancaster. Is that a violation of the Code of Ethics? Please say yes. Remember, the code is very, very clear. It is a violation of the Code of Ethics for anybody to go and show homes in an area they are unfamiliar with. As I shared, I've sold in Glendora. My daughter lived in Glendora. She was in university in that area. So I was up there all the time. I'm very intimately aware. I've sold a ton in Orange County. And so I'm very familiar with Orange County. I will avoid some parts of San Diego County because frankly, I know Orange County better than I know San Diego County. There's certain parts of San Diego County I will not ever go to. It's a violation of the Code of Ethics for me to do so. So you have to make sure, remember we talked about a buyer counseling session. You have to make sure you're having a great conversation with them and understanding exactly what it is that they want and why. What are they looking for? Obviously, you need to also have a price point. What are they able to buy? What are they able to pay? Now, I'm going to take you back in history because it's relevant to what we're saying here. Many years ago, when I was in Connecticut, I did a lot of relocation counseling for the company I worked for because they had a huge relocation division. And I was the only manager in the county that intimately knew every town in the county. Connecticut's very different. Fairfield County, Connecticut, very different from California. And so I literally could speak to everything from Darien and Richfield to Fairfield and Monroe. I could speak to them all. And so when because I was doing counseling, I was effectively relocation counseling with that potential consumer to come into Fairfield County. My job, and it's the same in this case, My job was to ask them the right questions, make sure I understood what they were looking for and understood their price point. My next job was to say, well, if this is your price point, then unfortunately, some of the communities you'd love to be in might not be part of that equation. Because if you've got this much to spend, the average prices in these areas are this for what you're looking for. So which concession, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, do you want to make? Do you want to raise your price or reduce what you're looking for? It was a conversation. That conversation was very, very clear. And I was very successful at helping facilitate a lot of people moving into Fairfield County from other parts of the country. So when you look at 3A, locations, cities, counties, price ranges, what do they want? Now you could have an attached list, 3C. You could have it attached one particular property only, 3B. So you could actually have a buyer representation agreement for one property. But what you should have is, I only want to look in Pleasanton, maybe San Mateo. Here's the price point I want. Here's how much, here's what I'm looking for in my home. So in the other section, I want 4-bedroom, 3-bath, at least 2,000 feet. Here's how much I have to spend. Obviously, this also brings up the conversation about, have you spoken to the lender? Do you have your financing in place? Obviously, all of that is happening in the first 3 paragraphs of the buyer representation agreement. Then you get to paragraph 4. Compensation to broker. And the amount of rate compensation is not fixed by law. It's set by each broker individually, may be negotiable between buyer and broker as da, 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 da. And then 4A, buyer agrees to pay broker as follows. And it applies unless 2 or 3 is checked. So either a flat fee in number 2 or compensation schedule attached in number 3. Now let's talk about 2 and 3, and we're going to come back to the real wheelhouse of number 1 of 4A1. But number 2 could be a flat fee. Number 3 could be, if I do this for you, if I do that for you. It was one of the things that Rob Hahn spoke about, was there could be a change where instead of, and this is all going to be DRA related and brokerage related, maybe instead of a flat fee or a flat commission, I take an hourly compensation. In other words, I get paid by the hour for doing specific things. And so that would be 4A2 and 4A3. You can't do any of those things without your broker approving that it's okay for you to do them. It's not something that you can unilaterally do, I believe, in the state of California. Also, state of California has a very clear picture on advanced fees, so you cannot ask for a retainer because advanced fees are against the law in the state of California. That goes back to the financial crisis. So what you're going to do is take a compensation package. You're going to say 4A1, this % of the acquisition price, and then there's an end there. I have seen, and I don't like, but I have seen brokerages or agents put transaction coordination fees in that spot. I will tell you, in all my management years in California, I did not allow that to be done. And I will share with you why. There was a different class action lawsuit. I want to say it was in Orange County, California. It named the 2 major companies, which at the time were Prudential Cal and Coldwell Banker, and I think one other, don't remember who, but it was a while ago. And the class basically said to the brokerages, why am I paying your company a transaction coordination fee to do your job? So I didn't allow it. I do my own, I pay my own transaction. Do I have a transaction coordinator? Yeah. I often will do some of the paperwork myself in the very beginning, but at later on, I will add more paperwork, but she does that, but I pay that fee. So I am not a fan of adding transaction coordination fees in that box, but that's between you and your brokerage. I'm only speaking to my own personal position. I just don't think it's a good idea. But what it says there is buyer agrees to pay broker as follows, blank % of the acquisition price. So walking with me so far, not too hard yet. Now, so accounting for payments to broker and by others. If anyone other than a buyer compensates broker for services covered in this agreement, that amount should be credited towards buyer's obligation to pay. If third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to broker or credited to the buyer or other. Authorization to include commission in the offer. Remember, I talked about that earlier. You can, with permission, include compensation in California in our contracts, include compensation in the offer with permission from the buyer. So what that basically is saying, you have an obligation to ask the buyer that. But what you sing in D2, what does that say? Let's pretend there is an offer of compensation through the MLS still before things change. And the offer of compensation is a figure, and you know, I'm not going to speak to numbers at all. I'm not speaking to percentages. I don't want to do that by any stretch of the imagination. But the point is this. In the prior slide, for A1, a percentage of the acquisition price. 2, third-party payments received exceeds obligation. So if I ask for a certain percentage amount to be paid to me to represent that buyer, whatever that number is, whatever that percentage is, and then if looking at D2, if the offer of compensation through the MLS at this point in time is equal to that, then the buyer doesn't owe me anything. If, however, it isn't equal to that, the conversation becomes and I promise I'm going to dialogue with you because I know that's a thing. Then the buyer may be responsible for a different amount to make up the difference for whatever I said I wanted. Now, remember, this is a conversation. This is not just sign here, press hard, 3 copies, which we don't do anymore. This is a conversation. This is part of your buyer counseling session where you're having the conversation with the buyer, basically explaining exactly what you do and how you get paid. And we're going to walk through some more of it because it becomes challenging at some levels. If the compensation being offered in the MLS at this point in time is equal to what I'm asking for, then the buyer owes nothing. If, however, it's less than, then the buyer can owe that differential. It does not mean that the buyer can't still negotiate with you, because they can. Let's talk about what if the offer of compensation is higher than what I've asked for in my contract. I would share with you personally, there's no way it would be as likely as me jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge for me to ask to keep that money. To me, if there's an obligation of some amount and the offer of compensation in the MLS is a higher amount, in my mind, that goes back to the buyer. But you have the option to have that conversation with the buyer about it. But I want to go back to, before we talk about the next little section, and we talked about compensation, buyer agrees to pay broker as follows: this percentage amount or a flat fee, as we talked about a moment ago. I want us to go back again, though, when we go back to this section where we have to talk here in the contractual relationship. What I have found to be the case more often than not, and this is across the board in all my businesses, is the failure, and I hate that word, the inability to get a buyer representation signed is more often about the way you're having the conversation with the buyer rather than the buyer just not wanting to do it. And I can go back to my friend in Connecticut who had a buyer representation class only, and her position was she never, ever, ever showed a property without a buyer representation agreement. And if the buyer, and she basically, what she did is she put the contract down in front of them, said, here's what I need you to look at and review and sign, left the room, allowed them to read it, came back in, and her position was that if they didn't sign it, she didn't think they were really ready to be a buyer. But if I look at beginning on and ending on, here's what I have done forever. And in every single case, it works very easily, because what I find is hesitation usually comes, well, nobody's ever asked me to do that before. Why should I do it now? Thing one. I'm not comfortable creating a contractual relationship with you. We don't know each other. Thing two. And I would love to have someone else give me another objection because I want us to unpack this. So Jody says, when does this buyer broker agreement get signed? Before or after can show them? No, before you take them in your car, you have it signed at the buyer counseling session. Before or after the buyer can show the buyer's agent a full underwritten pre-approval? No, I would get the contract signed right away. You're going to have the conversation, Jody, you're going to have the conversation with the buyer. Have you spoken to the lender? And I would still get the contract signed. But if they refuse to talk to the lender, then it's not worth, forgive me, it's not worth, frankly, you getting the contract signed, because if they're not ready to look at homes and not ready to buy a home, there's not a lot of logic there. But let's go back to the timeframes. So if there's another objection that someone else has, other than what I just shared, I never had to do that before. No one ever asked me. I'm not comfortable being in a contractual relationship with you because we don't even know each other. Are there any other objections that anyone wants to share with us? Because I'd love to hear them, because I want to address each one of them before we move on. Those are the two primaries that I've heard in my lifetime, if you will. And I'm going to share with you, I have a very simple answer. So let's pretend I'm working with a buyer. I have gone through my value proposition. Go ahead.
Jenny.
Yes.
Jenny, this is Janet Halliburton, and I just got on the Zoom because when I first started, I had to update it and I went to the phone. So I couldn't speak before when you were talking. But I think there's another reason why buyer brokers are reluctant to ask for that. And that's because they don't even know the true value they bring to the table. So it's like they're starting in the middle of the conversation. You're starting at the end, when they don't realize, as much as all of us don't realize what we do. We educate people on a process that's very important to them, but they've never had any exposure to it for the most part until they get ready to buy a house. And so it's really difficult. You bring everything you know to the table with that person to help them go through this transaction. And it's difficult to quantify all of that when you're sitting there in the middle of doing it. So they don't even know their own value. This is why I think which
I've spoken about. Thank you for that, Janet, I think you said. And I thank you for that, because that's absolutely true. I said at the very beginning this morning, we totally fail. We completely fail as an industry. And I'm generalizing the heck out of this. Forgive me. I know there's a boatload of real estate agents throughout the United States. I'm still going to say it out loud because I've been all over the country teaching. We are terrible at explaining what we do and why should we get paid. We don't know how to articulate our value. And I would share with you, one of the things I want you to take a note on is Google this. I don't know what we did before Google. Google this and basically state very simply, the Google question is 184 things real estate agents do. You're going to get a whole lot longer list than you used to get, because ever since Pat Combs testified before Congress on this issue, because, I guess back in those days, also people, what does a real estate agent do? Why should they get paid? That will help you articulate what it is that you do. And frankly, when you're in a value proposition situation where you're sitting down and having your buyer counseling session, this is not something like, let's go look at houses here, sign here, let's go play. No, this is an appointment with you and a buyer ready to buy. Hopefully they've already talked to a lender, they're really ready to buy. And it's a conversation. And I would share with you, if it's under 45 minutes, it's not enough. And you're going to walk through exactly who you are, what you do. You ask the great questions of what do they want? Why do they want it? When do they want it? What's the purpose of it? All those questions must be asked at the very, very beginning. You talk about how you work. You have your resume. And by the way, even if you've been in the business in an hour and a half in real terms, I would guarantee you everyone I've ever known in real estate has had some other experience base in their lifetimes, even if it was university where you were a volunteer in something, or you were in some type of leadership, even if you're, and no discount whatsoever. I was a mom. I still am a mom, but she's 35. I don't have to raise her anymore. Being a mom is a full-time job. You are a scheduler, you're an organizer, you're a problem solver, you're all of those things. Everybody was new once. We don't do a great job of articulating our value. we must have a resume, testimonials if you have them, even if the testimonials are from something else that you've done. It doesn't have to be from real estate if you're a brand new agent. It can be from something else. Testimonials, express your value. Here's what I've done in the past. Here's how I solve problems. Here's what we actually do. And for all of this work, here's what I'd like to get paid. And quite frankly, if you don't do that, why should a buyer sign a contract with you? Is what are they buying? If you're not good at explaining that, what are they buying? Nothing, because you haven't told them what they're buying. Why? I wouldn't sign a contract with anybody for any purpose whatsoever if I didn't know exactly what they were going to do for me, exactly how they've been successful in the past, exactly what it all looks like. And if they can articulate that with me, then yeah, I'll sign a contract. But if we don't do that, we're failing, and it's on us. And that is one of my great, can you tell? One of my great frustrations on a national level. It's not just here, it's everywhere I go. We don't articulate it well. So go and Google 184 things real estate agents do. Then use that as your guideline. You must have a resume. You must have a pledge of performance, which is, by the way, it's in the accredited buyer representation class that is just being rewritten again because of all of this stuff. Articulate your value, articulate what you do, articulate and explain your past experiences. You know, in my case, I can proudly say 100% of my business is referral. I've even had referrals from past students that I've sold homes to. All of those pieces all together, we must explain it. For all of these things that I do for you, and here's what my success track has been, this is what I need to get paid. When you do that well, I don't see hesitation. But I will also share with you, here's another way to handle the objection, I don't know you. You know, for me, it's easy because, as I said, most of my business is coming from people that already know me or have worked with me in the past. I have less of an issue because of that very thing. But when it's done well, and the only thing is, you know, I'm not sure how I feel, and here's what I have said forever. And I'm answering Jody's question without really answering it. The question is, what if the buyer wants to get out of the buyer broker agreement? And do you have a sample of a buyer represent from a brokerage? No, Jody, it's in zip forms. This document, pieces of this document exist in zip forms. It's exactly what I'm showing you. It's called a BRBC. Go to zip forms, pull it up, review the whole document. But let's talk about what Jody said. And here's what I used to do. I recognize number one, I'm going to pretend I'm really role playing with somebody. I see some hesitation. Please listen to the words I use. Talk to me about what your hesitation is. Did you hear me say, talk to me? Describe for me? Share with me? Please begin to use those words. Please use those words in part of everything you do as negotiation. So talk to me about, and the response may be, well, I really don't know you, and I'm not sure I want to sign a long-term contract. I've got a solution for that. I'm now the agent again. I've got a solution for that. Why don't we do this? Why don't you and I sign a contract for 10 days or even 7 days? No, you either pick 7 or 10. Why don't we sign a contract for a week? Our beginning date will be today. Our contract will end 7 days from today. And during that period of time, I should be listening to you well enough to only show you homes that could be perfect for you. Now, remember, there is no such thing as a perfect home, but perfect for your criteria within your budget. And if I do that well, my expectation is there's a very real possibility we'll write an offer and have something we might be able to open escrow with within that 7-day time frame. If, however, at the end of the 7 days, we haven't found it or you weren't able to get it, then I'm going to ask you to extend it, because by then we're going to know how we work well together. But if at the end of the 7 days you don't like me, maybe I don't like you, then we don't have to continue any longer. Our contract is over in 7 days. Doesn't that make it easier for you? That way, notice my head is shaking. Doesn't it make it easier for you to be able to do that? So we're going to get to know each other over that 7-day period. And if I'm doing my job well and I'm listening really well to you, then we should be able to have success within that period of time. The end. Right? Does that sound better? So Steffi says, do you mean the one that has been completed? I'm not following. Going back to Jody's question, If they want to get out of it, if you only have a 7-day contract, they don't have to get out of anything. I personally have never, ever signed a lengthy contract with anyone. I've never had to. Usually it's maximum 2 weeks. And 2 weeks is enough time for you to prove yourself, they to decide if they're real buyers, and it's no longer an issue and the problem goes away. Mark says, love the 7-day. It works, guys, it works. Trust me, it works. Now, depending on the consumer, remembering I'm from New York and I'm a little bit wacky, here's what I would say. You know what? I get it. I've got an idea. We don't have to get married. Why don't we just date? Let's just go together for 7 days. We'll go out and look at houses for 7 days. If at the end of 7 days, we both like each other and I'm doing my job, we like each other more, then we can keep dating. Does that sound better? So I have just diffused the fear. I have taken away the tension. I've never had anybody not sign based on that alone.
And then,
Go ahead.
and then after that 7 days, how long is that time period?
What do you mean?
How long do you do a buyer broker's agreement?
Well, what I have said, I'll say it again. What I have said is in that 7-day period. Now, if there's no inventory whatsoever, it could take longer than 7 days.
That's
I'm
our
not-
market.
Stay with me a second. I believe I already know the market well enough to know. I've already know what kind of they're looking for. If there's something out there, I'm still going to do 7 days, because here's what I'm going to say. If at the end of 7 days, we choose not to work together any longer, please, and I've shown you any homes during that 7-day period. If at the end of that 7-day period, if you decide we don't want to work together any longer, any homes I showed you during that period of time, I will still be your agent for. But if you want to cut the cord and you want to move on and you're not interested any longer, you're free to do so. If I want an extension because we like each other, then we'll extend and probably be another 7 to 10 days or 14 days. It really depends on what the market is telling me. Are there choices? Why are you shaking your head no?
Because our market is, I mean, I have buyers, I mean, I show them property at least once a week. And we've been at this for 3 or 4 months. They've written offers. Everything is multiple offers because the inventory is so low. We go for weeks at a time where it doesn't fit that criteria. So, I mean, it could be anywhere from 4 to 12 offers with the buyer.
Mm-hmm.
Before you get them into contract.
So I'm going to ask a question. What do you think the solution is, Heidi? Let's say you do a 7-day contract and you can't get anything. What would you do?
It could take up to 6 months.
So what would you do?
I write a contract for 6 months.
So then you don't have a problem any longer, right?
Right.
Because what you've done is you've proven yourself in that 7-day time frame. Now, if your market doesn't support 7 days, then do for 10 days. But if at the end of that, remember, your job during that period of time is to make the buyer comfortable with you and she or he decide to continue working together. And you're going to be closing for that throughout the time. So, well, we gave that one a shot and it's really too bad it didn't work. And then we get to the end of the term, you know, how are you feeling? I'm really enjoying working with you. I would love to continue doing that. Do you agree with me? Well, yeah, I really like you too. I know you're trying hard. Okay, then let's sign an extension on our agreement. And let's sign it for this many months because it seems like that's what it's going to be. And you don't have a problem. What I'm explaining to you is do a test run. Put your toe out on the ice to see if the ice is supportive, can support you. And then in that period of time, you get comfortable with each other and you then create the extension. And Mark says 3 months or not 6 months. The market will dictate that to you, but you also have during that period of time have to be able to explain that to them. Let's give this a shot. We may find something that's perfect. I want us to get to know each other better so you're not uncomfortable with signing an agreement with me. That's what this is about. Literally, it's like dating. Let's see if we kind of like each other. At the end of the dating, let's have another date. And we're going to extend our contract. There is not a problem. It's just the dialogue. It's the way you present. So it works every single time. And you're not the only market with that. It's the same. Oh my gosh, I've been everywhere. I can't even tell you. And there are pockets that are doing well and other pockets that are failing horribly. Now, I want to include this here because we have to talk about it. And obviously the numbers are not California numbers, but they're easy numbers to do mathematically. One of the other challenges we have is lenders. And the difference between adding and including the fee, the compensation, is there's a difference. So the lenders are not going to allow you adding it to the mortgage. So buyers, again, please don't question me on the numbers. I get it. They're just easy numbers to work with. And this is national content, frankly. Buyers purchase a property for $100,000, a down payment of $10,000, a mortgage of $90,000. They want to mortgage $93,000 to pay the brokerage fee of $3,000. The lender's not going to let them do that. Because, and by the way, with all of this, guys, I didn't even mention this before, I'm going to say it now. There is no question that the lending industry is going to have to change as well. With everything that's happening, the lenders are also going to have to change. But it's not there yet. It's coming. Just pay attention to everything going on. So the lender's not going to say, roll your, again, these numbers don't qualify in California. Just work with me. Pretend there's another comma and a zero or 3 more zeros. But the lender's not going to say, add it to the mortgage payment. But the lender will allow including it. Buyers purchase a property for 103. Obviously, it has to be appraisable. Down payment of 10,000, mortgage is 93, and buyer broker compensation is paid through the proceeds. So this, and then you have to create a separate document. So the document is created, the property appraises, the seller receives $103,000. The document then says from the 103,000, it's no different than we do currently. From that 103,000, pay $3,000 to the buyer's representative. But it's not coming directly from the seller. The buyer is paying it, but frankly, the buyer pays it all anyway, because that's how the seller gets the money to pay the compensation. So bottom line problem, impact, depending on the buyer, depending on the price point, depending on where you're in the country, the buyers usually don't have the additional cash. The lenders won't let them add it to the mortgage. They'll pay the seller less. That's another thing that may happen if the sellers are no longer going to be required to pay buyer compensation. Is the seller going to reduce their price? That's going to be additional. See, that's one of the things that's come up in my brain so much is all of this additional education that's going to be necessary. There's so much more education that's going to be required. Like, how do you dialogue with the sellers? Mr. Seller, you don't pay the buyer compensation any longer, so we need to look at that and deduct that from the price. Compensation comes out of the agreed upon price, and the buyer is willing to pay and the seller is willing to accept at the bottom line. That's how it works. Here is a challenge. The VA does not allow a buyer to pay a buyer's representative. It must be commission split with the listing broker, cannot exceed offered commission, and it becomes messy. I actually had heart failure when I was in a town I will not mention, somewhere in the United States. It was cold and snowy, so it wasn't California. And I had an agent in the room say to me that what she did is when she closed on one, she had a buyer representation agreement. She actually had the buyer pay her compensation outside of the transaction. And I just about had heart failure. I said, that is a violation of federal law. You do understand that the settlement statement is a HUD document and has to be accurate and perfect. And so I did recover. So this is a place the Veterans Administration is going to have to change when buyer compensation is no longer available through the transaction, as it has been. So we're coming to the end. Here's your key points. And then I want us to talk a little bit and we'll be done for the day. The most important piece is relational. Agent and the buyer seek the right relationship to facilitate the process. Conversations must be clarified. Must have a buyer consultation with that buyer. Please understand, it's not like it used to be back in the old days when you just run out the door and show a buyer a house, which was in itself really foolish and kind of dangerous, but separate issue. Buyer consultation involves asking questions, answering questions, informing, giving them your resume, giving your value proposition. You must practice articulating your value proposition. You must have something in writing. You must have a really good resume or a bio on what you've achieved. You must have testimonials attached to everything that you're doing for you to be able to facilitate these conversations. Make sure that you're creating consistency across brands. Make sure that you don't violate the code of ethics. I was asked by Nebraska to teach the code of ethics updates. And I got to tell you, I had so many eyes rolling to the back of their heads. They couldn't believe it. Like, no, you can't do that anymore. Can't do that anymore. Not allowed to do that either. and they did not know. The code of ethics changes every single year. Something changes every year. I suspect there will be more code changes coming through all of this. And then creating buyer loyalty. And as you think through all of these issues, understanding how it all comes together, the major issues within this structure, without talking about the scary stuff again, it falls to you. The better you are at articulating your value, the better you are explaining to the buyer what you do for which you get paid, the better you are at understanding their needs and concerns with respect to signing a contract, getting them over that hump, and then continuing the relationship, the better you communicate with them, the less likely you're going to have pushback on getting the documents signed and having a successful career no matter what. I do not see, and it's happened a lot of times when I've talked about these topics, I'm not convinced that it's going to be a situation where buyers are just going to go to listing agents and we're not going to be needed anymore. And that's also going to fall to us because we have to do a better job of explaining why having representation as a fiduciary to a buyer is better than dual agency. Forgive me, but it's true. Dual agency, in fact, when I was managing, there were agents in the office who would come to me and I want to be in dual agency. No, you're not allowed to. Well, why not? Because you don't know what you're doing. If you don't know how to truly represent each party equally and fairly, don't do it. And it's risk management for leadership. And I would not be surprised at through all of this, there becomes a situation where dual agency becomes less and less of a possibility state to state. I can only ask you to do one more thing, and my contact information is on this slide. I do want us to talk. My contact information is there. I promise you, if you reach out to me, I'm happy to help. But guys, this is no longer, I want you to tell everybody who should have been with you, and you all know who they are, should have been on this call today, needs to find out what they missed. And I would ask you to please pay attention, watch what's happening. Don't be afraid, because fear doesn't solve anything. Be pragmatic in thinking about what you're doing. Make sure you're ahead of the curve, not waiting for the curve to catch up to you. And the more educated you are, the more firm you are, the better you are at articulating your value, the less of a problem this is going to be. Do I think that it's going to be a change? There's no question in my mind. But I started predicting buyer compensation be out of the MLS. I was saying 2023, 2024. I still may be right. I don't know. It really depends on whether the Sitzer case does go through the court system in October or if it gets delayed again. The Mulder case is supposed to go to court in 2024. It'll be interesting to see what other MLSs do. Don't ignore this because it's something you must be paying attention to. Do I think that the industry as we know it is going to change? Without question. Do I think we're going to be gone? I don't, because I still believe that buyers and sellers need us. We just have to be better at articulating our values so they understand what we can do. And you must be that educator, and I'm going to beg you, get people in classes, get them educated, have them learn. Therein lies part of the problem. So I've talked to Jake. I'm hopeful maybe we can get something going up there. Maybe I can bring an ABR to you guys. It would be lovely to be live there if possible, maybe not. Although Jake tells me he works in a different state. I might have to go there and work where he is. Only kidding. Just don't be afraid. So questions, we're finished. It's 1:15. I've got to believe, you might have a couple more questions or more points of clarification. Please unmute yourself. Go right ahead. Go ahead, Heidi.
Hi, Jeannie. So do you have a link here for the ABR classes?
It's high. I have to be hired by the association. I am teaching, if you reach out to me via text, I am teaching ABR for North Carolina in, I think, September. It's going to be a Zoom, so you can be anywhere in the country and get on board. The only negative, now I happen to be an early riser, so it's not that hard for me, but it starts at 6 o'clock our time, which means 9 o'clock in North Carolina, but you're welcome to be a part of that. If you want to register for that class, let me know, just text me and I will let them know to reach out to you, to give me your information. Any of you that want to be a participant in that class, let me know. If there's a possibility of getting it up to you locally, I'll find that out from Jake. Anyone else have any questions? Are you all mad at me and hate me, or do you feel like you got some?
I do have a comment, Jenny.
Yes, please.
This has been a great program. And but my comment has to do with the folks who are going to be up there in front of the judge, trying to argue our case, are they realtors or attorneys?
They're attorneys.
Okay, that's one of the problems.
Well,
Because-
no, they're attorneys for the National Association of Realtors.
Oh, I get it, but
Yeah.
what they're doing is dismantling an industry, not just talking about compensation. All of the things you mentioned, first of all, the buyers come in burdened with fees already.
Mhm.
So the chances of their being able to, it depends, and they look at high cost areas, but look at the Midwest and the South. They're burdened with taxes, with closing costs, with down payment, with rising rates. And so it's going to default to them saying, well, I can't afford to do that. And they might go to just what you mentioned earlier, go to the listing agent. And this is one of the things that the industry has sort of insulated itself by having a buyer's broker and having the compensation the way it is because the seller has the equity, and the equity is created because the buyer, there's a shortage, and the buyer is making the offer. But in the meantime, we have all of the legislation that we're responsible for. The buyer has all the costs that they're responsible for. And this situation is not a simple one.
But you got to
So-
realize, I'm not saying that, NAR is trying to defend the industry to the best of its ability. It's
I
the
know.
it's the classes that are saying we're not worthy. It's the class action suits that are saying, what do we really do? Are we worth our dollars? All of that is what it's about. But I have to come back to the thing I said earlier, and this is the unfortunate part, and it breaks my heart, quite frankly, is that we have just never done a really great job of explaining what we do well. And we probably have all had a transaction at some part in our career where we weren't sure how well it was going to go with the agent on the other side. One of my coaching clients, because I do a lot of agent coaching as well, and one of my coaching clients was calling me with the transaction she was in the midst of, and she had a profoundly adversarial agent on the other side who just was brutal to work with. That doesn't help us. We as an industry have to be better at mutual support and being collaborative with each other, and realizing our job is to work to the benefit of the consumer for which we get paid.
But yes, you're right. But many of those arguments are not made in court. I don't think they really understand what the jobs of the agents are, and how many deals would not be made if it weren't for a buyer's agent.
I don't disagree with you, but my suggestion, if you really want to have some entertainment, you can find the full entire class suit and read it and see what these are buyers. These are consumers who've worked with real estate agents who have created this class lawsuits, 2 of them. And these are consumers who have said, I have been let down by agents. I have been failed by agents. It is not the real estate industry it's the consumers who have said, just like it was in the lawsuit I mentioned to you that came in the late 80s, early 90s. It was the consumers who said, we were not cared for to the degree we thought we should have been by this particular company at this time in history. What we have now is 2 different sets of groups that are both saying agents have not done their jobs to protect us. And as I said earlier this morning, one of them actually flat out says buyer's agents really don't do much of anything anyway. I can't fix what they believe. I can only make sure that you all understand what we're being accused of. And we do a better job of being the best we can be.
But do we have that? That's my point. Do we have a buyers on the other side? That's why I asked, are the attorneys the only ones that are pleading our case, or do we actually have consumers?
You mean testifying?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not that involved in the intimacy of the actual. We have not gone to court yet, but I will share with you that the judge has already said that this is a jury trial in October. And it should be probably a jury trial next year as well. And in the case of that's going to be the basic everyday consumers that are going to be sitting those juries. And they are not permitted to be realtors or family members of realtors sitting the jury. So this is going to be attorneys going at each other in front of a jury, and the jury and the judge are going to decide what happens. Consumers, and their message is agents have not done their job.
Well, there are so many consumers that could argue the other point. And those attorneys should get those consumers to be on that jury.
I
just
am
like
not
they
in
do.
any way, I hear you, I agree with you fully, but I am not going to try to speak to the head of NAR's legal department and say, you know, I'm not going to question her. I'm going to expect her to do her job. I would not want to be her right now
Okay.
because it is really difficult. She's got 2 classes in the Department of Justice, all at targeting NAR. Not fun. It's not pretty. And I'm sure she's very, 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 very smart lady. I would be confident that she's going to pull in whomever she can as witnesses and or to testify on her behalf. She's a very smart attorney, and I can't imagine she would not call in those people best able. If you want to go to competition.realtor, which is an NAR website, competition.realtor, there is more content there on the NAR website. On what they're doing, how they're doing it, what their positions are, all of that can be looked up on competition.realtor, and then you can get a better handle on exactly what they're doing.
Okay.
Jody says, in general, realtors have a bad rap, just like pit bulls have. I don't disagree with you on the pit bulls. My daughter had one. She was the sweetest dog in the world. But yeah, but you know what? I'm going to say this out loud, and I'm going to share it with you because I have, you know, doing it as long as I have. I mean, I remember, this is a funny story, and I'm going to try to make it light at the end. There was a guy that wanted to come to work for me when I was managing in Connecticut, and he was telling me his resume and sharing how his high opinion of himself. And I had agreed to meet with him. I wanted to see if anybody was wrong, but you know, he looked at me and says, you know, telling me this whole thing, and I said, I can't hire you. And he said, don't you know who I am? I said, yeah, and that's why I can't hire you. Now that's real. Because we all have met those agents that, I mean, when you're working in a small town like I was in Connecticut, there were agents in that small town that you sincerely hoped, if you're a listing agent, you did not have an offer from one of their buyers because you knew it was going to be brutal. And you're not wrong. Realtors have a bad rap. I agree. But at some level, there's some out there that have not made the problem easier. And as I said, when I was teaching short sales all over the country, and even when I teach everywhere else now, the people who should be in the room, like the 110 that signed up and 32 of us showed up, the people that should be in the room who need the education, who need to be better at their jobs, who need to understand how to be better at their jobs are the people that unfortunately often don't show up, which breaks my heart.
Yes.
So Steffi said 184 things realtors do, but you're going to find more. Mark asked, can you give us the Google search? Again, 184 things real estate professionals, whose real estate agents do. Oops. And you can find it. It's easy to find. Jody says, bad rep comment because I think it's going to be an uphill battle in the court. It's not going to be pretty. But the most important thing is all of you guys are going to be more prepared than anyone else. I want you to, even if you're not going to, I want you to promise you're going to sit down and create a great value proposition. You're going to create a great list of what you do, your bio, your resume, your testimonials. You're going to do all of that. You're going to commit to having a buyer counseling session, explaining to the buyer exactly what happens. And when you do that well, you're going to have a better and more successful career, and the consumers will love you. Yeah, go ahead and look up, go to realtor, competition.realtor, and you'll get more information. I think that we are done unless there's anyone else.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, guys. I really enjoyed meeting you, and thank you for your comments. And just if you need to reach out to me, hi, Karen. Thank you so much, sweetheart. I appreciate it. I'm glad I got to see your pretty face. Thank you for showing up. Thank you to everybody. Please know that my contact information is there. Text me. I'm happy to respond. If I can do anything and answer any questions, don't hesitate. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.